Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Allison K. Dagny. Today, we are going to be talking about navigating isolation after emotional and narcissistic abuse. This is a really important topic because so many people who've experienced emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse have been isolated from family and friends within the abusive relationship, and then oftentimes after they get out, it becomes even worse. So it's really important to know how to deal with this, especially if you're someone who maybe didn't have a very broad circle while you were being emotionally abused, if your abuser kept people from you, if they tried to stop you from seeing friends or family members and things like that. If you did have a pretty decent circle, like for instance how I did, then after the emotional abuse, when you start to basically say, yeah, this is what happened to me, people who you thought were your friends, really sort of exit your life. And there can be other situations where the abuser is going on a smear campaign and things like that. So I really just wanted to talk about this because I think it's going to be helpful for people who are suffering after experiencing the trauma that they've gone through, and now it almost feels like another kind of trauma. So the first thing that I want to talk about is understanding what this is, right? Understanding the nature of isolation. A lot of times you think of isolation like being in a deserted island all alone, and that's ultimately how it feels. But there are different forms of isolation that you may experience after your abuse, and these can range from all different kinds of things. So again, you could be isolated from your family if an abusive person has, during the relationship, really soured those relationships for you. And then once you get out of the relationship, those, familiar relationships are strained, or maybe you haven't spoken to your family in years. And it might be really hard to get that support back, because if you have chosen the abuser over your family, it's very possible that those people feel hurt and don't want to support you anymore. That's really, a high probability and can happen. Now, if you have family who's never really given up, then hopefully, which hopefully you do, those people will still be around to support you when you have escaped the abusive relationship. Friends is a whole different issue, right? Because friends can get frustrated easily, especially if they're good friends and they know that you've been abused, they know that you've been going through a lot of horrible things. They may become frustrated and have isolated themselves from you, or decided they don't want to be in a friendship with you. The other flip side to that is the abuser may have said things like, I don't want you being friends with this person anymore. I don't want you hanging out with them. I think they're a bad influence on you. And so if that's the case, then you may have ended those friendships to keep the peace in your marriage or your relationship. And then the most difficult, I think, is if you have children and you have been isolated from your children. And this can happen in many, many different ways, where the divorce or separation, the children have been sort of dragged through all of the court proceedings. The abuser may have attempted to paint you in a really bad light. If you have older children, maybe those children have opted to not be around you. Maybe they look at you like you're the crazy one because they've been made to believe that by the person who is the perpetrator of the emotional abuse. So this is a really deeply painful type of emotional abuse, and when you're isolated from the people who you love the most, it is extremely difficult to deal with. So ultimately, the reason why all of these different kinds of isolations occur is because the abuser wants control. The person who has hurt you wants to maintain control of you and your life. And they want to punish you, ultimately. So by keeping you isolated within the relationship, and then also after the relationship, knocking down any semblance of support that you may have had, lying about you, going on a smear campaign, and isolating your children, is ultimately just for that person to feel like that they have some sort of control over your life. But you can get your power back. And I'm not ever suggesting that you can get your people back, but there are ways that you can manage how you feel about it if those people have made their choices, right? We can't control the choices that other people made. If they believe the abuser, if they, have decided they are going to side with them instead of you, right? We can't control that. We have to find our own people. And there are lots of things that we can do to influence. But, ultimately, any relationship, whether it's with friends or family or kids, it's a two-way street, right? So we're not going to be able to force people to be in relationships with us. And unfortunately, this happens to a lot of victims. And the thing that I want to share with you is that when this has happened to you and you feel at a loss and you feel isolated and alone and you feel like there's nothing you can do, there is something that you can do, that you can gain more peace in your life, regardless of how other people show up or don't. Okay, so what happens when we are going through isolation, right, is, and you know this if this happened to you while you were in the emotionally abusive relationship, is that your self-esteem, your confidence, like feelings of worthiness are just in the toilet. Like you don't have any of those things. Often you don't really have anyone to turn to. I remember in my emotionally abusive marriage, often I was turning to people within the family. So meaning his family, his mom, his sister-in-laws. So ultimately, like I did have some other friends and things, but the goal from what I believe in my marriage for my husband towards me was to maintain a very small circle that could keep control over everybody within it, right? So this, I feel like this kind of came top down from his mom, to maintain this circle. I even remember when my brother-in-law had gotten married and her family was coming in from another state to visit, and this had been, I don't know how long it had been, but we knew the family and things like that. But I remember his mom saying like she didn't want them coming to our family dinners. She didn't want them coming over and hanging out. This was like our family space, blah, blah, blah. And I just remember feeling how like absolutely selfish that was. And of course I couldn't do anything about it. It's not my house. It's not my, she's the matriarch technically of the family. But I just felt like it was really dishonorable and didn't make me look favorably at her, because it was like, no, this is my little family. Nobody's going to encroach on my time with my family. So I think that's sort of how the isolation starts, where, they want to keep you in this little bubble. And the reason why they want to keep you in this bubble is so that you don't go out and find out the truth, so that you aren't able to see. It's cult mentality. It's like being in a cult. When you're in a cult, that top-down dictatorship and control is designed so that you aren't able to think for yourself, that you aren't able to see what's actually happening because you're inside the bubble, right? You don't have access to, it's sort of like communism, right? Like the things that those people are being able to watch, see, read are controlled, right, by the government. Advertisements, TV, radio, all the stuff is controlled. So it's the same mentality when you are in an abusive relationship where there's isolation from the outside world, and many times from the people who really and truly have your best interests at heart. And often that can create lots and lots of problems for you and for the people around you. And when this happens, right, the abusers will do things like use gaslighting and manipulation. And gaslighting, just because I want to just clarify this really quickly, a lot of times people just think gaslighting is lying. Like if someone says, I never did that, well, you're gaslighting me. No, that's not what gaslighting is. And I just want to make this very clear because there's a lot of confusion in this, recovery community about what gaslighting is. And gaslighting is really when someone is making you doubt your reality, right? So and not only doubt your reality, but start to believe that you're crazy, Okay. So it's not just one person saying, hey, did you turn the light on today before you left? And they said, no, I didn't turn the light on. And they say, yes, you did. And they say, no, now you're gaslighting me because I didn't do that. No. The gaslighting is when they would say, oh, did you turn the light on? And you say no, and you know you didn't turn the light on. And they said, well, for the past several days, I've been tracking this and I've been paying attention, and you have been turning the light on before you leave. I've been noticing it, and I think you need to go have your mind checked or your memory. Something's wrong with you. You don't remember things. And then you start doubting yourself and like, oh, maybe I did turn the light on. Oh my gosh, like I could have sworn I didn't, but then this happens like a slow drip over time. It wears you down, and then you really have no sense of identity at that point, right? So we are going to talk about how that happens in another episode, because the feelings of not knowing who you are and your identity loss, we're going to talk about that also. Okay, so when this happens and you start to doubt yourself because of that, and you're unsure, you have difficulty making decisions, this is all a part of what isolation does to victims. A lot of times what victims will do was they'll isolate themselves, right, to avoid more confusion and pain. You may withdraw, you may avoid conversations, you may avoid people, avoid going places, because you have such fear of how that feels to not really understand yourself, be able to think for yourself and things like that. So those kinds of things can actually happen from isolation. And again, I'm going to talk about that on a later episode, about the identity loss, because I think that's really, really important. Now, another thing that happens is when you have been isolated in this way is that you could develop trust issues, because you may have this like really deep fear that people won't believe you or will support you, or that they may double down on it. Oh yeah, I did notice that you've been a little forgetful lately. Oh yeah, I did notice this, right? And then that can lead to withdrawal from other things. And then the abuser can also isolate you intentionally. And this is what I feel like happened in my marriage, was that it was like discouraging me from going out and doing things with people because he was going to be alone, or he was going to, have to take care of the kids. And then I was going to feel guilty about it, right? It may be like preventing you from having these social connections because they disapprove of the type of person, or they think that you're going to do something because you're being influenced by them, right? So a lot of things, and then all this stuff kind of combined together just turns into this big snowball, and over time you feel totally alone. The other thing that I want to make sure to talk about is that when you are experiencing especially self-isolation, right? The reason a lot of times this happens is because victims often blame themselves for the abuse, or like they've done something wrong, right? So you end up feeling really ashamed of your situation, and then thinking that other people are going to judge you, or something negative is going to happen from that. And then what that does is that shame ultimately, as you know, I talk about the subconscious mind all the time on this podcast, and shame is an emotion, and that emotion drives your behavior, right? So if you have this emotion of shame that keeps coming up, it can actually dictate your behavior and prevent you from reaching out for help, right? Because you're feeling such shame about it. Why would you reach out for help? Because it's just going to make that feel even worse that other people know about this. And then what that does is, if you're not reaching out for help, it's leading to more isolation and more loneliness. Now, how this all comes full circle and then just keeps this repetitive pattern of isolation and loneliness is when isolation, which it often does, leads to depression, anxiety, feelings of hopelessness, things like that are actually compounding the experience of the abuse that you went through previously, or if you're currently going through it, as you're trying to heal, right? So all these things are just like kind of compounding it and just making it worse. So victims often will just not be able to see a way out of the situation. And that's what I talked about last week on the podcast was, escaping the emotional abuse swamp, like that horrible feeling and place of where you're stuck. So if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to that one from last week. But victims really have a hard time when you're in this kind of state of mind to actually see a way out. And there is a way out, but as I'm saying, like this, it turns into this, like, I don't even know what to call it. Like it turns into this like cesspool of like sludge that you just are unable to even believe that there's a possibility to get out of, but there is. Now, I want to share with you my experience with this isolation. And if you read my book, like I was isolated from my mom pretty heftily by my ex-husband because I think he knew that my mom was aware of who he was at the core. Luckily, my mom never gave up trying to be in my life, but she did it at sort of a little bit of a distance. Like she wasn't pushy, she didn't pressure, she just kind of maintained a distance. And then whenever we were willing to allow her to come in the house or hang out with me or go out to dinner or hang out with the kids, then that's when it happened. And, I'll just tell you, like, in that marriage with my ex-husband, my husband at the time, there was a lot of tears and a lot of arguments and a lot of guilt on my part because I was so frustrated that he was so staunch about not allowing me to have a relationship with my mom. And I can even remember when my first daughter was about to be born, and I said I'd like my mom to be in the room when she's born, and he absolutely refused. He said, I don't want your mom in there, but my mom will be in there. And I was like, what? Like, this is my body. Like, I don't want your mom in there. Even though I liked his mom, like back then, I didn't want her in there. Like, that's really personal and private, and I wanted my mom to be in there. And we had arguments and arguments about this. And finally, I had put my foot down. I said, if my mom cannot be in there, your mom cannot be in there either. It will just be the two of us. And ultimately, that's what happened. However, because of the relationship and the nature of the relationship we had with his parents and how my family was mostly isolated, his parents were the first to visit. They were the first ones there. And it continued on my second child and my third child because they were watching the older children while I was in labor, and then they would bring our children, the older children, to come see the new baby. Again, got to be the first ones in the room. So this isolation, right, is something I'm very, very familiar with because almost like I didn't feel isolated because I did, but I also had a support system, which was his family. So it was like his family replaced my family. But guess what happens when you get divorced? Now you have nobody, right? Now I don't have any of those people. The extended family, the cousins, the aunts, the uncles, like all the people that were in this family are literally gone. And thank goodness I still had my dad, and my mom was eager to come back into my life. My brother, and that relationship never really changed much, but there was a lot of friends that I didn't have, like friends that he didn't want to be in our wedding, and that created problems, so didn't have those friends anymore. And then a lot of the friends who we had mutual friends of, like people who were in our friend circle, right, that he ended up rallying to his side that I no longer am friends with. And so what was really, really difficult was now I have to have an entire reset. I have to find new people. Who are my support people? Where do I turn? So this was really tough. And if you've experienced this, you understand. And the other worry that I had was, because I had 3 small children at the time, was that he would ultimately try to isolate me from them. Now, I tried my very best and did everything that I could do to prevent that from happening by being the best version of me that I could, by making sure that I was in therapy, by making sure I was taking care of myself, by making sure I wasn't getting triggered by the things that they came home and told me about their dad, by not disparaging him and talking horrible about him and his family. Like, I did everything I could possibly do because I wanted them to see the truth, because I didn't want them to believe any of the lies that his family and friends or whomever was saying about me. And I think it paid off because I have a really great relationship with my kids to this day. They're all teenagers now. Okay, so all these things, right? I understand what it feels like to be isolated. I understand what it feels like to have to go out and find new people and find a new tribe. I also understand that those people were never my people. Those people were never meant to be long-term in my life. They were for a season of my life, and I had to mentally process those things and emotionally process those things because, yes, it feels like a loss. If you can find the people who used to be there for you that maybe you were isolated from and reconnect with them, even better, right? Because you probably had a strong connection with those people at some point and it just got eroded over time in the abusive relationship or beyond. Now, I wanted to share this with you because I really feel like it's important to you to know that I do understand this, right? I have an extremely small circle now, and I like it that way. I really, really like it that way. I'm not saying you have to like your circle the way it is, but I actually prefer the quality of the people being in my small circle than having a lot of people and them being poor quality. So that's just from my perspective, but I have had to do a lot of deep inner work to help me release the pain and the anger about being isolated for so long, and then continually that isolation that happened after getting out of the emotionally abusive relationship. Now, one thing I think, if you have a pen and paper, this would be really, really helpful, is to acknowledge your feelings and your emotions about this. Like, so if you have been isolated and you are isolated now and you're feeling really upset about it, it's important to acknowledge that. You have to take this crucial step towards your healing. If you don't acknowledge it and you just stuff it and you're like, oh, like whatever, they're just bad people, or they just believe him and they're dumb and blah, 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 whatever, right? Like, you got to feel these emotions. And I'm sorry if you're sitting here like, ooh, I don't want to. I'm telling you, the only way to the other side is through. Okay, so you have to feel them. Now, you don't have to stay there, right? That's the important thing. I'm not saying wallow in these emotions, but absolutely, yeah, you need to feel them and acknowledge them, because otherwise those emotions, which are energy in motion, emotion, are going to stay stuck in your body and create problems for you down the road. So I like the analogy of someone overstaying their welcome in your home when we're talking about emotions like staying inside of you. And so think of like a person who came to visit. It's important to acknowledge and understand them when they arrive, right? You meet them at the door. Hi, you're here, coming in, blah, 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 right? But just as you wouldn't let a visitor overstay their welcome, right? They're not staying forever. You're here for a visit. Then you can allow these emotions to exit, right? And then pass through. You're not just the same way you wouldn't allow the person to stay indefinitely. You shouldn't be allowing these emotions to dominate your life indefinitely. So, processing these emotions and taking the steps to move forward is going to be the number one thing in your best interest when you're dealing with these feelings of being isolated. Other things that you can do, again, which I'm going to refer back to, is finding your tribe, right? So again, I don't have a very big tribe. I actually have a pretty significant tribe online. I have a ton of friends that I talk to either weekly or daily in social media. And I love, love, love this tribe. So you can find people like this too on social media, Facebook, Instagram, different places like that, joining groups like healing communities and things like that from people who understand. You're going to feel so much more fulfilled when you're dealing with people like this versus people who like look at you like you got three heads when you talk about the abuse, right? It's much nicer to deal with people who are like, oh my God, I get it. Yes, I totally understand. I went through the same thing, or here's my story. So, looking for these things, reaching out for these networks is going to be highly beneficial. And I'm not saying it's going to be an overnight process, but you start to maintain friendships, you start to connect with people, and there's a lot of women out there who really want to be in these supportive communities. And then another thing, and I'm always going to come back to this, is reprogramming your subconscious. So remember, your subconscious mind plays a crucial role in whether you feel isolated or you don't, whether you feel shame or you feel empowered, right? So your subconscious mind is running 95% of the show. So it is literally driving how you feel. So if you don't like how you feel, then the best place to start is your subconscious mind. So things that you can do, which I talk about all the time on this podcast, you can go back and listen to any of these episodes, is literally starting with what you think about on repeat. What are the thoughts that are coming up most often for you when you're feeling isolated? I shouldn't have to be alone. They shouldn't have done that to me. This is not supposed to be how my life was going to turn, or this isn't how my life was supposed to turn out. Whatever those thoughts are, right? Those are the things that are driving the feelings of isolation. So what you have to do is start to challenge those thoughts. And that is very difficult if your brain has been on this pathway for a long time. But that's where somebody like me comes in, where I can help you shift that, because I know lots and lots and lots of possibilities. I've run through this. I do this work all the time for myself, and I do it for my clients as well. So I'm really skilled at helping you start to see the different possibilities when your brain goes, I can't see any reason why this should have happened, or I can't see any reason why that is the way it is, right? And I can actually help you do that. So there's a lot of other things that you can do that are going to be more coping things, like meditation, visualization, breath work. Like those kinds of things are all wonderful, right? They're going to help you process these emotions. But ultimately, if you want to change how you feel, you have to change how you think first. And that's the root. And that's what I do, is I work in the root of the problem. So just as a recap, it's important to acknowledge your emotions. Don't allow them to stay for too long. Allow them to pass through, and find your support tribe, right? When you're feeling isolated, that's going to be super, super helpful. And reprogramming your subconscious mind. Without that piece, everything else is coping. And that's fine. Like if coping is your thing, then that's fine. But for me, it was not. I was like, no, I'm done. I do not want to be coping anymore. I want something that's actually going to change how I feel. So that is where you start. Whether you work with me or whether you work with somebody else, truly, that's where it's at, is reprogramming what's happening on a subconscious level to change how you feel so that you can show up differently in your life with the people who you love. So I just want to remind you again, I offer free 20-minute chats. You are welcome to schedule this from the show notes below. If you just want to talk about my coaching program and you want to learn about that, you can get on a free 30-minute consultation with me. So I hope this episode has been helpful for you. I hope you find your tribe. I hope you don't feel isolated. Again, this is all about isolation. If you just want me in your corner, again, schedule that 20-minute call and I'll just listen. I'm not selling anything. I'll just listen to you and we can have a connection and just be friends. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you next week.